Thanks, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here this evening. I want to start actually by saying something about where I come from. This is a talk about where we come from as a species, but I think it's relevant to think about ourselves in this context as well. So 20 years ago, I was graduating college, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. I had gotten a degree in animal physiology, thought I might want to be a vet, applied to vet school, didn't get in anywhere. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do with my life, and I got a job working at the Boston Museum of Science. And I discovered my passion and love for science education. At the Boston Museum of Science, I met my wife. I met my future career as well, because one day, my boss asked me to help update our human evolution exhibit. There had been all these new discoveries in the field of human evolution, and we wanted to update our exhibit. And I said, well, I don't know anything about human evolution. And she said, that's fine. Go to the library and start reading some books. This is before the internet, or before you can Google these things. So I went to the library, and I pulled out some books by Ian Tattersall. And if you haven't read anything by Ian Tattersall, I think you should if you're interested in the talk after today. I devoured his books, and I became obsessed. I caught what's called the Hominid Bug. I became absolutely obsessed with the stories that these old bones tell us, not only about ourselves, but about these ancient creatures who lived and breathed and laughed and cried and eventually died in a context that was fortunate enough for us, millions of years later, to be able to find their bones and tell their stories. And so tonight, what I want to do is tell you two of those stories. I want to tell you about two discoveries. Now, the title is talking about one of those, but in order to talk about one of those, I have to share with you what came before the discovery of Homo naledi. And to do that, I want to take a big step back and just frame all of the fossils I'm going to be discussing tonight in a bigger picture. So we know, and we've known for some time, that humans are closely related to the African great apes. And there's evidence from genetics, there's evidence from comparative anatomy, from behavioral studies, that we are closely related to the African great apes, and in particular, to bonobos and chimpanzees. Now, this does not mean we evolved from a chimpanzee any more than a chimpanzee evolved from us. We share a common ancestor with these animals. They live today. They're our cousins, not our ancestors. But if this is the case, if in fact humans and chimpanzees share common ancestry, and the genetics can pinpoint the date, more or less, of when we share the common ancestor, and that's about 6 to 8 million years ago, then there should be fossils of things that are neither modern human nor modern chimpanzee found in fossilized sediments dating back upwards of 6 million years on the continent of Africa. And sure enough, we have them. We found lots of these things. In fact, we have about 2,000, or prior to what I'll talk about tonight, about 2,000 fossils from the African continent. Now, many of these are isolated teeth, or isolated finger bones, or a femur there, and a humerus over there, or jawbone over here, and a piece of a skull over there. But each of these fragments is precious in helping us reconstruct this story. However, when I tell my students that we have this many fossils, I'll say, look, we have thousands of fossils, and I want you to know a lot of them. They get really discouraged, and they have to study. But think about the timescales we're talking about here. We're talking about millions of years. And a million is 1,000,000. So even if I'm being generous and say, okay, we have 3,000 human fossils, you would still only have a fossil for every 2,000 years of human existence. So imagine if I ran up into the stands and grabbed someone's lower jaw, and that became the representative fossil of the last 2,000 years of human existence. We'd be missing some stuff, right? Lots of interesting things have happened that wouldn't necessarily be recorded in the jaw of a single individual. And so we are a growing science in the sense that every time we make a new discovery, it forces us to go back and reevaluate some of the things we once thought were true about human evolution. And the stories I'm going to tell tonight are great illustrations of that. Now, with all of these fossils that we have to organize them somehow, in some way, and contextualize what happened in human evolution. So big picture stuff now. What we know is that the earliest members of our lineage that go back to 7, 6, 5, even 4 million years ago We're in a group of animals that I group together in what we call artipithecus, or root apes. These things are very, very ape-like. They had grasping big toes and long curved fingers that would help them climb in the trees. Their brains are about the size of a chimpanzee's brain. But what makes them members of our lineage are that they can walk on two legs at least occasionally, and they have small canine teeth. So of all the things that make us human, of all the ways in which we're different from our African ape relatives, the things that seem to happen first in our lineage are reduced fang teeth compared to other primates, and the ability to at least occasionally move around on two legs. Around 4 million years ago, we start to find a different kind of critter in those fossilized sediments, and that's what we call Australopithecus, represented here by the famous Lucy skeleton discovered in Ethiopia in 1974. Australopithecus is mostly what I study. I love these guys. They're fascinating, fascinating animals. Their brains are only slightly larger than a modern ape's brain, so a gorilla-sized brain and a chimpanzee-sized body, so slight increase in brain size. Again, those canine teeth are small and dull. They're found exclusively on the continent of Africa, but what makes them more human-like is they now are obligate upright walkers. This is what they do. They walk around on two legs during the day and forage for food, and then they probably will climb a tree at night to get away from predators. There is evidence of stone tool technology for the first time in Australopithecus, which becomes much more important to members of our own genus, which shows up in the fossil record around 2 million years ago, characterized by longer legs, more human-like body proportions, larger brains. We start to see encephalization or brain enlargement accelerate in the human lineage. They start to expand their territories to the point that their ranges now go beyond the borders of the continent of Africa. And we find them in Asia and eventually find them in Europe. And in Europe, they evolve into Neanderthals. But back home in Africa, they evolve into our species, Homo sapiens. This is supported by genetic evidence and by the earliest fossil record of Homo sapiens in Africa at about 250,000 years ago, or generously maybe 300,000 with a new discovery. Homo sapiens is an African species, but again, with our success, our ability to extract resources from the environment, our symbolic thinking, we again start to expand our territories and move into Europe and into Asia, where we bump into Neanderthals and absorb their genomes into our own, and eventually populate the world, and eventually put our footprints on other worlds as well. That wonderful moon exhibit that you have out there was quite inspiring that I saw earlier. Now, what I want to focus on now is this group Australopithecus, because the very first Australopithecus fossils were discovered in an area known as the cradle of humankind in South Africa. These fossils were found in cave sites, discovered initially in the 1920s into the 30s and 40s. And this is a good time to introduce my colleague and friend into the narrative here, and that's a guy named Lee Berger. I've known Lee for about 10 years now, and around that time, Lee had been working at a site at the very top of that map known as Gladysvale. And Gladysvale is one of the most beautiful cave sites I've ever seen. You go into Gladysvale, and there are fossils all over the place. Fossils are pouring out of the rocks, pouring out of the cave walls. And working at Gladysvale for nearly 2 decades, Professor Lee Berger discovered thousands of fossils of antelopes and zebras and wildebeests and warthogs and elephants and giraffes and baboons. But he only found 2 fossils of an early human, an Australopithecus. He found a tooth and a pinky bone, and that was it. So naturally, Lee was getting a little bit frustrated and wanted to engage in a new project and a new exploration of this area. And at this time, a new technique was being developed or was being utilized, and you probably used it too. It's something called Google Earth. And he used Google Earth to examine this landscape of the cradle of humankind in South Africa. So this is an animation showing you as we fly into the cradle of humankind in South Africa. And when we get there, it's pretty brown and arid and dry. This is classic African landscape, right? Grassland, expanded grasslands, acacia trees littering the landscape. And every once in a while, shown with these red stars, are clusters of trees. But these trees are stinkwood trees and olive trees. These are trees that actually need water. And the question that Lee and his geology team asked was, where in the world are these trees getting their water from? How are they getting enough water to grow on this otherwise arid landscape? And what they figured out was that these trees were acting as bullseyes for where the caves are. The caves would pool water at their base, seeds from the olive trees and the stinkwood trees would come blowing in, and then the trees would eventually sprout out of these vertical cave shafts. Using this approach, Lee and his team discovered 300 new caves that nobody knew about in the cradle of humankind. One of them is the one we were just circling. That's a cave called Malapa, M-A-L-A-P-A, Malapa. This is what Malapa looks like from the ground. It's not very impressive. It's just a hole in the ground. It's just a pit. And yet that pit has yielded 2 of the most complete early human skeletons ever found. 2 Lucy's. But they weren't found by the paleoanthropologist Lee Berger. They were found by his 9-year-old son. And this is Matthew telling the story real quick.
This is where I found it, and here's a rock that looks about the same size as it. And when I turned it over a bit, there was the clavicle sticking out. But when I saw it, I didn't know it was a clavicle.
So Matthew, your father was working around here, right?
Yes, he was.
And you went off wandering.
Yeah, I just followed my dog Tao down here, and then a big rock caught my eye. So I called my dad over, and when he was about 5 meters away, he started swearing, and he came towards me. He was like, it's a clavicle of a hominid, and I was like, whoa.
So Matthew initially saw a clavicle. I have a replica of it for anyone who wants to see it afterwards. If there was any doubt, when Lee flipped the rock over to the other side, there was a lower jaw that was sticking out. And that lower jaw had the distinctive, worn-down, small canine tooth that you find in humans and members of the human lineage. So in just 5 minutes at the Malapa cave site, Lee Berger's son had found as many fossils as Lee had found in 20 years at the site of Gladysville. So this would have been a great discovery no matter what. But as the researchers were collecting this fossilized cave dirt that we call breccia, all of these chunks of rock had hominid fossils coming out of them. But what I tell my students is, look, this isn't Indiana Jones science. We don't go into a cave and just find fossils lying on the surface. Instead, they're embedded within this hard rock, and that fossil material then has to go back to a laboratory where carefully, underneath a microscope, it needs to be prepared by skilled preparators. And here in this museum, there's a preparation lab that's being set up, and you can see this for yourself, how this actually works. I have a lot of students that say they want to be paleontologists, and they want to find fossils, and that's great, but then most of your work, or a lot of your work, is done doing this, and they spend an hour doing this, and they don't want to be a paleontologist anymore. This is a really tedious task. You have to be focused. You have to have enough caffeine in you that you're not going to fall asleep, but not too much that your hand is jittery, because you're using these tiny little mini jackhammers to slowly, grain by grain, remove the fossilized soil or the dirt, the rock, away from the fossil itself. Now that's Lee Berger up in the picture, and maybe you can read the expression on his face. Lee is not a particularly patient individual. This takes a long time to do, and Lee is staring at this chunk of rock that's really, really, really interesting. Now here is that chunk from a different angle. This chunk of rock clearly has a bone sticking right in the center of it. That is a humerus. It's a right upper arm bone. It's from a juvenile. There's an open growth plate, so that individual was still growing. And a very careful eye, see if I can use the laser pointer here. I don't see it. But up in the upper right-hand corner is a tiny little tooth. And whenever you see a tooth, you get pretty excited that maybe that tooth is attached to a jaw, and maybe that jaw is attached to a skull, because skulls can tell us a lot, way up in that corner there. Now, if we handed this rock to our preparators and said, okay, prep out this rock, a month may pass, and you may have a pile of prepared dirt and a tooth to show for it. And so there are other techniques that we can use, and we're using more often to prepare these fossils. This rock was transported to a local hospital where Lee Berger's wife happens to be a radiologist. And she gave it a CT scan, and this is what that scan looked like. Yeah, it's amazing. So the tooth is sticking out at the bottom. It's that bright white thing. And then you see the silhouette of the skull. There is, in fact, a skull in that rock. So now with this information, our preparation team was able to prepare out this fossil with much more care and in a much more informed way. And what emerged was this absolutely extraordinary skull. Very often we find fossils and they're in pieces, and we have to use our knowledge of anatomy and a whole lot of glue to put them back together again. But this particular specimen, oh, I pulled out the wrong fossil. This particular specimen is in a single piece. This is a replica of it. The original remains in South Africa, but you're welcome to look at it afterwards. It's an absolutely stunning specimen. But it's not just the skull that was discovered. Remember I mentioned to you that there were 2 Lucys that were found, and here they are. On the left, we think we have an adult female. On the right, a juvenile male. But a female and male what? Fossils don't come with labels. We had to get to work, head to toe, studying the anatomy of these things to try to figure out whether there's something similar to fossils we'd already discovered before, or is this something different? Now, it helped to know the age of these fossils. Our geology team worked on the cave sediments and determined that these fossils were from creatures that lived about 2 million years ago, around the end of Australopithecus and the beginning of the genus Homo. Head to toe, there were anatomies in these skeletons that we had never seen in a combination before. And so they were named, in 2010, a new species, Australopithecus sediba. And what's shown blown up are the teeth. On the left, there's a wisdom tooth shown from the adult female, and it's all worn down. That's how we know it's an adult. And on the right, you can see his 2 molars, but then there's a circle. There's the open crypt. His 3rd molar hadn't erupted yet. By human standards, he would be about 10 years old or so, although we have examined his teeth more closely and think that they would have grown faster than humans do today, and he would have been closer to about 8 years old. Now, whenever we make new discoveries in science, oftentimes the publicity around them, you hear about the new discovery and a new species being named, and then that's the end of the story. But for the scientists, that's the beginning of the story. That's when we really start getting to work asking questions like, what did they eat? How do they move? How do they utilize their landscape? How are they related to other things we knew about? And so we've been spending the last 10 years studying these creatures from head to toe. There are studies that have looked at the hand of this creature, the foot of this creature, its pelvis. I have a student right now with a paper in review of what childbirth would have been like in the females of this species. So we're looking head to toe through this animal to really reconstruct its paleobiology. What was its life like when it was alive? The skull itself has been CT scanned, and what you see in blue in that rotating skull is an endocast of the brain. So the brain size is about the same size as a chimpanzee's or a little bit bigger, but the brain is structured more like yours and mine. And so this is evidence that brain reorganization would have preceded brain enlargement. There are folks who do paleo artistry who have gotten involved with this project because of so many bones that we have. This is incredible work done by Elizabeth Daines, who is a paleo artist, and she has fleshed out these creatures, put muscles where we know muscles are, put skin where we know skin would be, and then, of course, apply quite a bit of artistic license to flesh them out. And this is what this 2-million-year-old ancestor of ours would have looked like. Now, I've been working with a team trying to figure out how they moved. Their heels are quite odd. Their ankles are unusual. Their knee looks a lot like ours, but it's different in some peculiar ways. The hip joint looks like ours too, but not quite. There's these fascinating differences. And so I started working with a team of physical therapists, trying to think head to toe through this body how it would have worked in concert while this creature was walking around its landscape. I then involved a student who's interested in video game design, and we started animating this skeleton of how would it have moved. And we just published our results earlier this year. After 2 million years of being in the ground, this is Australopithecus sediba walking again. Now notice she has long arms, curved fingers, walking a lot like us, short steps relative to most people. So it's quite human-like until you get into this plane. There's a lot of rotation happening. She's doing what we would call hyperpronation. So if people walk or run in this manner, it predisposes us to injury. But those unusual anatomies of Australopithecus sediba were anatomical solutions to the very problems that humans face today if they walk this way. And so we think she was adapted to move in this particular manner. Why she was moving this way, we think it was because she was still very, very comfortable in the trees. Her anatomy of her shoulder and her fingers and even her reconstructed diet would support that. Now this is what Malapa looks like today. We're still digging at this site. Lee and his team still digging quite a bit. There's now a beautiful architectural contraption above that hole in the ground. And so visitors to the Cradle of Humankind can go to Malapa and they can see the excavations happening in real time. And so this is a group of my students that was excavating at Malapa a couple of summers ago, and we found a small piece of hominid fossil that we think belongs to the cheekbone of one of these individuals. And so fossils are still being found, and these fossils are going to help us test some of the hypotheses that we have developed about this absolutely fabulous creature that was discovered again in 2008 by a 9-year-old. Now, I will remind you that Lee Berger's Google Earth survey of this landscape revealed hundreds of caves that we didn't know about. And I just told you about one of them. So what about the others? This is an overwhelming task, right? Exploring all of these caves. And so Lee got the word out to spelunking communities, folks that go into caves in their spare time, that there's interest in bones. And if you happen to come across fossils or come across bones, there is interest in the paleoanthropological community. Enter Steve Tucker and Rick Hunter. These folks here, these are not paleoanthropologists. These are amateur cavers. They were in a cave known as the Rising Star Cave. This is not one of the 300, but they knew about, or at least found out eventually about Lee Berger. They were in the Rising Star Cave, and they were looking at the back of one area that had a particularly tight squeeze, and they went through that down into a chamber, and when they arrived in that chamber, what they saw was this. Now, I'll remind you, earlier in this talk, I said that this is not an Indiana Jones science, and we never just find bones lying on the surface of a cave. And yet, here are bones just lying on the surface of a cave. So I was at my desk, I was at Boston University at the time. This was in October of 2013, and I was at my desk working late, and I got an email from Lee Berger. And the subject line said, "Check this out," and there was a photo attached. Have you ever gotten an email like this? Yeah, you delete it, right? Obviously, a virus said, he had gotten hacked. Check this out, a picture, okay. But my curiosity got the best of me, and I'm glad it did, because I clicked on the picture, and this came across my screen. I was stunned, and my initial thought was, this can't be a fossil. That's not how we find these things. This has to be a recent person. We should contact the police. Maybe this was a lost caver, and these are their remains. But you study the anatomy a little bit more, and you realize that that can't be the case. So if we look at the teeth, for instance, here's a beautiful jaw right here. And one of the things to notice is how big those molars are, and they get bigger as you move to the back row of the teeth. So that's a really large wisdom tooth. Humans today, as much as we complain about our wisdom teeth and have them pulled out of our heads, they're typically not the largest of the molars. But in the past, in our ancestors who were snoutier, it was the largest of the molars, and that's what we're seeing here. Now, this looked like a single skeleton lying on the surface there, but it's vulnerable, right? And at any point, amateur cavers could come into this chamber and scoop up these bones and put them on their mantelpiece, right? And they would be gone. They would be lost to science. So this is a vulnerable set of fossils, and an expedition had to be put together rapidly in order to retrieve these bones. However, Rick and Steve, even though they could get into the chamber, didn't know much about fossils. They didn't know much about human anatomy. They didn't have degrees in anatomy or archaeology or anthropology, and they didn't have excavation experience. We needed people who had a combination of skills. We needed folks who had higher degrees in anthropology, archaeology, or anatomy. We needed folks who had excavation experience. We needed people who were comfortable in a cave. We needed people who could work in a team. We needed people who could drop whatever they were doing and come to South Africa for 3 weeks to dig up some fossils. And we needed people who could squeeze through gaps in the rock that narrowed down to about 7.5 inches. So to give you an idea of what this looks like, this is one of those tight squeezes in the Rising Star Cave. Any volunteers? So how are we going to find these people? Well, Lee came up with the idea of posting on Facebook and Twitter an advertisement that we're looking for skinny scientists who had this set of skills, who had excavation experience, caving experience, and knowledge of human anatomy. And we found 6 people who fit that skill set. They're all women scientists. They came to South Africa in November of 2013 to excavate these remains. This was incredibly difficult work. This is work that was physically taxing. I would imagine quite emotionally taxing as well, doing this work over this time. These are some of the squeezes they had to go through. These are images from National Geographic. And this is a really beautiful schematic taking you through this chamber of secrets. The start is up here. You get to this point. This is where I've turned around and go back. I wasn't going to do this. You come down here into what's called Superman's crawl. That's one of these really tight squeezes. You have to arrange your body sort of like Superman flying to get through. And then there is this series of jagged rocks called Dragon's Back that's actually quite narrow from side to side. And there now is your tight squeeze of about 7.5 inches down the chute and into the Dendritic chamber where all these fossils are. These are the working conditions. Notice that there are no shovels down there, no excavation equipment. Paleontology is a delicate science. Porcupine quills were being used, and plastic spoons, and little mini trowels, and dental picks. As fossils were found, they were labeled with flags. 3D laser scanners were used to document positions of fossils before they were wrapped up in toilet paper or bubble wrap for transport back up onto the surface. Those who were quite envious of the folks that were down there doing the excavation could watch it all on TV, because cameras were installed down there as well as some communication equipment to make sure that everything was safe down in that chamber. Now, one of the things I absolutely love about this fossil expedition was that it was live tweeted. Most fossils are found in really remote areas, and they're found sort of accidentally. Don Johanson didn't know he was going to find Lucy the day he found Lucy, and even if there was the ability to tweet it out from there in 1974, there wouldn't have been much reception anyway. But here, it was known there were hominid fossils down in the ground, and so part of the calculus was, let's let the world know this is happening. Let's communicate this to classrooms around the world and let them know that fossils are being discovered in real time in South Africa. And so there was all this social media around these discoveries, and ultimately, what was recovered from this cave in those 3 weeks and then a few additional recovery efforts were almost 2,000 fossils of 17 different individuals. Now, to give you a sense of magnitude here, remember I mentioned earlier that on the entire African continent, in the history of our science, we are lucky, if we do the math generously, to have had 2,000 fossil discoveries, if you count up every single tooth and every single tiny little pinky bone. So in one expedition, we effectively doubled the number of fossils from the African continent. This is extraordinary work. I am so grateful for this work because it gave me the data, the fossils, to ask some questions about our evolutionary history. And this is a good point for me to mention to you that you're really lucky to be here tonight. And I'm kind of nerding out a little bit because one of the excavators of the Homo naledi fossils is here in the audience. Dr. Becca Peixoto is here. And yeah, I agree. Becca, can you stand so that people are looking around? So for those of you who have questions about what it was like down there and movement through the cave, as often happens when I give a talk like this, and I don't know because I've never been down there as much as I would have loved to have, Becca has agreed to answer some questions afterwards as well. Now, back to the fossils though. These are super cool fossils and amazingly interesting anatomies, but remember I told you earlier that fossils don't come with labels, right? We have to do some science. We have to examine the anatomy of these things to try to figure out, are these fossils of things we already knew about, additional individuals, or is this something different? Now, I went to South Africa in January of 2014 to work on these fossils for the first time. Usually when I work on a set of foot fossils, I have about a dozen of them, and I give myself about a fossil a day to work on them. So about 2 weeks to work on a dozen foot fossils, to draw them, measure them, 3D laser scan them, CT scan them if need be, study all the shapes, all the tiny little bumps and grooves where ligaments would attach and muscles would attach, to really work out how those bones work together in the living organism when it was still on this earth. Homo naledi had 106 foot bones. Okay, this is something I could not have done alone. And as more researchers were coming through, it was becoming quite obvious that we could not have a small team of researchers working on this. We needed either we were going to have a small team working on this and we'd still be working on it, and none of you would know about Homo naledi yet, or we are going to expand this operation and bring in a lot more researchers. And those researchers ended up being a lot of young career researchers, folks who had just gotten their PhDs, had data sets that needed a question to apply those data sets to. And here we had a question of what in the world are these things? And so we held a workshop in Johannesburg in the summer of 2014, and folks got to work trying to figure out what in the world are these things. This is the skull and jaw team led by Heather Garvin in the middle there. She's a professor at Des Moines University and got a degree in forensic anthropology and now applies that to paleo anthropology, or at least in this particular case. This was our torso team. They were working on vertebra and ribs that were discovered in the chamber. Marcus Bastier is a Spanish researcher in the middle there. Scott Williams from New York University. Sean Hurst was working on the brain, and so the skulls were scanned, and we could do internal reconstructions of the brain, and again, it appeared as though it had a small brain shaped more like yours and mine. We had folks working on the teeth, and the teeth are strikingly human-like, except for those large third molars, and when researchers examined the internal structure of the teeth, looking at where the enamel meets the dentin, they had an enamel dentin shape or morphology that was different from anything anyone had ever seen before. It was entirely unique. Tracy Kivel from the University of Liverpool worked on the hand, and I brought the hand with me. The hand is super interesting. It has a long thumb, a thumb that would be useful for precision grip and even a power grip, but it has these wonderful curved fingers as well. Quite a primitive-looking hand that would be useful for grabbing onto, well, we assume, tree branches, or maybe little Homo naledis grabbing onto their moms. They also had quite a shrugged shoulder that's more ape-like. I worked on the legs and the feet. We had a large team working on this material, and the legs and the feet are a lot like yours and mine. However, what was interesting about the feet is that all of the feet we found were from flat-footed individuals. It didn't appear as though any of the Homo naledis had an arched structure to the foot, and the toes are long and curved. Otherwise, though, very, very human-like foot. And the legs are a lot like yours and mine, except the joints are tiny. And so from that, what we've inferred is that they could walk in an economical way. They could get from point A to point B like you and I can without using much energy, but they couldn't do it over long distances. They didn't have the joints that were adapted for dissipating forces over a long period of time and a long distance, so they didn't have endurance. So they probably had small home ranges. Now again, this combination of anatomies was something we had never seen before. So in September of 2015, we announced these fossils as a new species of our own genus, the genus Homo. Homo naledi is what we call them. Naledi means star in the Sotho language, and that is to credit the locality where the fossils were discovered, the rising star locality. This publication was in a journal known as called eLife, and this is an open access journal. Sometimes people click on a scientific publication and it's behind a firewall and they can't actually read the science. And we didn't want to do that. We wanted everyone to be able to read the publication, to read the details if they wanted to. And so we published in this open access journal. This went viral. I don't know if you followed it when it happened in September of 2015. National Geographic was a big contributor to funding of this work, and it was a cover piece. It was above the fold in the New York Times. I was having former students contact me, and former teachers got in touch with me about this discovery. It was all over the place. I had cousins I didn't even know I had contacting me. And even the satirical website, The Onion, covered Homo naledi. Now, whenever you make a new discovery like this, it answers some questions, but it raises new ones. That's the beauty of science, right? Is we can answer some questions with new discoveries, but it raises new ones we never even thought to ask in the first place. And one of those questions about Homo naledi was, how in the world did all of those bones get down there in that little chamber? There were no bones of other animals, large mammals, no antelopes, no zebras, no wildebeests, no warthogs, no elephants or giraffes. It was just Homo naledis, 2,000 fossils of Homo naledis. And so you can start to hypothesize how this could happen. Maybe there's a leopard that specializes in Homo naledis, and it was picking Homo naledis off the landscape and dragging them down into a cave and munching on them. And if that's the case, what would you find all over the bones? Bite marks, right. So we examined the bones, there are no bite marks. Another hypothesis might be that maybe a group of Homo naledis got lost in this cave and they starved to death. And if that's the case, then all of the bones would be distributed on a single geological layer. As you dug down, you'd stop finding bones. Well, that's not the case. As you dig down, you continue to find bone. So this happened over a period of time. Maybe there was the occasional flash flood that washed through the area and swept bones into this chamber. And if it did that, it would sweep in sticks and rocks and bones of other animals. And we don't find anything like that. So this is what we do in science, right? We pitch a hypothesis, and then we test it with evidence. And all those hypotheses, we were just crossing out, crossing out, crossing out. And what we're left with is the hypothesis that this was deliberate. That Homo naledis, after they died, were being transported into this chamber and disposed of deliberately, and that this was happening repeatedly. This was a ritualistic event in the sense that it was happening over and over and over again over a period of time. This cave was important to Homo naledi. Now, this is a hypothesis that we will need to continue to test. If Dr. Peixoto goes into the Rising Star Dinaledi chamber and discovers a zebra skeleton, they probably didn't drag a zebra skeleton down there and shove it down into the chamber, so we might have to reassess this hypothesis, but that's how science works. So one of the other questions that we had was, when did this happen? Now, based on the anatomy, based on the shape of the skull, based on the shrugged shoulders and the curved fingers, I was going around telling people that this is a better Homo habilis than Homo habilis, that this is your ancestor to Homo erectus. When we get a date of this fossil, it's going to be about 2 million years old, and we're going to be able to anchor the origin of the lineage that led to Homo sapiens in South Africa. And I was wrong. As the geologists got to work in this chamber and examined the different rock layers and used really creative techniques of extracting information from fragments of enamel and quartz crystals that were in the sediment, what they found was that Homo naledi didn't live 2 million years ago, didn't even live 1 million years ago. It lived, or at least these Homo naledis, lived 250,000 years ago, 250,000 years ago, which is not that long ago, and is right around when our own species, Homo sapiens, was evolving on that same continent. These Homo naledis are not our extinct ancestors, they're our cousins. They're our extinct relatives. And so this is a family tree showing you Homo naledi's position here. We don't know necessarily who it's related to. This is a hypothesis, right, as all family trees sort of are. So here are humans sharing this landscape with, we talked about Neanderthals at the beginning, but now Homo naledi as well. And it's not just Homo naledi. Tolkien was onto something. 250,000 years ago, this was an active planet with different upright walking apes. In Africa, there was us, Homo sapiens. But also in Africa was this small-bodied, small-brained creature named Homo naledi. In Europe, Neanderthals. In Asia, a population that we know mostly through genetics known as the Denisovans. The hobbits of Homo floresiensis on the island of Flores lived at the same time. If you haven't heard of them, look them up. Super interesting fossils that we still aren't really sure where they fit into the big picture. And then just last month was a brand new discovery from an island in the Philippines, the Luzon Island in the Philippines, of a new species called Homo luzonensis that lived only about 60,000 years ago. Another tiny, tiny, tiny member of our lineage with anatomies different from humans today and different even from the Hobbit. And so this is a fascinating time in our evolutionary history, and it raises these wonderful questions and these fascinating questions of what happened to Homo naledi when they encountered Homo sapiens? What happened to the hobbits? Because they're gone. What happened to Homo luzonensis? We know the Neanderthals were reabsorbed into the human gene pool, as were the Denisovans. But Homo naledi remains this pressing question for us of what happened to this population. Now, one of the things that we've been able to figure out through the extraordinary work of our excavators and our explorers was that the Dinalidi chamber was not the only place where Homo naledi placed their dead. There is a second chamber, and it's a chamber known as the Locetti chamber, equally as difficult, I hear, to get to. In fact, Berger himself tried to get down into the Locetti chamber and now has an area of the Locetti cave system named after him called Berger's box because he got stuck. I think of sort of the Winnie the Pooh story of Winnie getting stuck in the hole and they have to wait him out and not feed him. Thankfully, Lee got out easier than that. But in the Locetti chamber, what was discovered was a partial skeleton of another Homo naledi. We don't know the age of this chamber yet, but the anatomy is very, very similar to the anatomy found in the Dinalidi chamber. And this is an individual we call Neo, which means a gift in the Sotho language. And this is Neo's skull, which I did bring along as well. And folks are welcome to have a look at this after the talk. Now, this is the only data slide that I'm going to put up. And I think it illustrates an important point that I want to make now. What you're seeing across the x-axis, so across the bottom of the screen, is time. 3.5 million years ago over in the left-hand corner, today over in the right-hand corner. Along the y-axis is cranial capacity, brain volume, brain size. The yellow line delineates your average chimpanzee, and the yellow line up here delineates your average human today. And one of the things to notice is that Australopithecus, Lucy and her kind, Australopithecus sediba as well, had brains that were slightly larger than your average chimp. Right around 2 million years ago, right around when Australopithecus sediba lived, brains started getting bigger and 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 bigger. And they topped out around 30,000 years ago, and ever since then, they've been getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Little known fact about human evolution is that our brains are smaller than they were 30,000 years ago for reasons we still don't fully understand. But that's another lecture. Okay, so over here, though, here is Homo naledi, these 3 dots. And here's Homo floresiensis. Look how isolated they are. They're outliers. And they raise fascinating questions of, are these dwarfed versions of this main lineage? Do the brains get smaller over evolutionary time? Or are there a lot more fossils out there to find? I tend to think it's the latter. Now, you don't have to believe anything I'm saying tonight. We have 3D laser scanned these fossils, and we've put them online for everyone. Everyone can check out the data for themselves, because these fossils don't belong to Lee Berger, and they don't belong to just a small group of folks. They belong to everyone. This is our story. These are our ancestors and our extinct relatives. They belong to the world. And so we have posted 3D laser scans of these fossils to this website, Morphosource. It's free, doesn't ask for a credit card or anything like that. You just sign in, and you can download these fossils and print out these fossils if you have access to a 3D printer, which a lot of libraries do, a lot of museums do, a lot of schools are now investing in 3D printers. And so after we posted these fossils, we were getting messages from middle school teachers all around the country, all around the world, showing us their kids with 3D printouts of fossils that came out of the ground only 5 years ago. A remarkable, remarkable effort to make sure that the whole world is aware of the evidence for our ancestry. Because we want to inspire the next generation of paleoanthropologists. It's not going to end with us. And if these discoveries are any indication, it's going to continue to accelerate. We're going to have more and more and more and more of these wonderful discoveries. Because think about it. If Matthew Berger had tripped over that rock, looked back, and then decided to keep going, maybe his father would have continued up the hill to go look for another fossil site. And we never would have known about Australopithecus sediba, but it would still be there. And if Rick and Steve looked in the back of the Rising Star Cave system and saw that tiny little squeeze and said, let's go home and watch TV instead, right? We wouldn't know about Homo naledi. And yet, those fossils would still be there. So can you even imagine how many fossils must still be out there waiting to be discovered? There is so much still for us to discover about ourselves, about our evolutionary history, and about our world. Thank you very much.